Thank you, Michael. That was a really nice introduction. It's really nice to be here. Thank you all for being here on a Friday evening. A very nice Friday evening, actually, where it would probably be nicer to be outside or just be resting. So I appreciate that you're here, and I will try to make it work for a while. I'm going to just talk about the different facets of my practice, so the things that Michael talked about, I'll actually talk about all of them, including teaching, which I've actually never done before. So it's really just a slice. It's not very in-depth in a way. It's just a slice of all of the things that I consider my practice. So the framework is building, unbuilding, and I'll be showing projects that kind of fall, well, that I've grouped in these two categories just for the sake of talking about them, and to be able to talk about the way that we do produce buildings, but also we're engaged in questioning buildings as objects and buildings in relation to social structures and things that are kind of immaterial. This catalog is kind of the list that I made to try to make sense of the different parts of the production. So there's Studio SUMO, a collaborative practice, like Michael said, with Sunil Bal. And we've been working together since 1995, so for quite a long time. And then at the same time, and actually predating that, I've been doing projects on my own. And so under the kind of unbuilding part is this other work that I've been doing, which is more, which was kind of enabled by a fellowship that I had through the Whitney Museum in their independent study program in studio practice and critical studies. And so I'll show projects that are kind of facilitated by that. And I'll just kind of go in first, like talking about the Studio SUMO work. We have three categories that we work in: university work, working in the arts, and then dwellings. One of our clients, Josai University, where I also have taught, and Sunil has taught, I've taught in the Women's Studies Department and in the Global Studies Department. And each time I've taught there, I've taught from the research that I was doing. But over time, we initially started, our relationship was as academics teaching, and then they were building, and over time we gained their trust, and they asked us to first do some studies, and then one of them happened. So I'll be showing, two projects from this university. This one is at the front of the university, and there's a campus walk that takes you back. And at the back of the university, this is our first building in this kind of J shape with a bridge that connects it, which is a business school. So this School of Business Management was actually our first building. It's 75,000 square feet. It consists of auditoria at the bottom, 3 levels of classrooms that kind of loop around in a J, and then a graduate center. The building has, in the center, it's basically open so that you would go up here, go up and onto the hill, which you saw in the picture. So that's like going through here, behind this, up those stairs, up to this level, and there's a kind of deck out here. This is a cafeteria. So these projects, our capacity in Japan is that we do concept design. So the client asks us to, they say they want to do X project. So in this case, it's a business school. We meet with the faculty. They tell us what kind of classrooms they need and what their idea for the public spaces were here. The idea was to have a different type of university than they have in Japan. University building, especially for a business school. They wanted to have open spaces, the equivalent of swing spaces for students and faculty to kind of mix. It's a very hierarchical system generally, so that mixing, yeah, that's a good slide. Like these spaces show these kind of swing out spaces. So places where the faculty could meet with the students in an informal way and where students could meet other students in an informal way. So the building has the classrooms and offices and the graduate center, but a large part of it is actually these more open spaces. And so when we were designing this, we also designed the furniture. So everything that you see here, like the colors, the furniture, those were things that we designed. Or most of it, like for this area, we designed. In other places, we selected it. Then another thing working for the Japanese projects is we work with a contractor, and contractors there are very different than here. They're kind of a one-stop shop in that they have all the design disciplines within them. So they have architects, interior designers, landscape designers, mechanical engineers. Everything is kind of within the construction company. And so when we need, we do a landscape layout, and when we need to pick plants, we work with their landscape architect who helps us pick the right plants and kind of make sure that we follow whatever the regulations are. When we're designing the building, we work with their architects to make sure we have the zoning correct and things like that. And then also we work with them on the details. But usually we do a concept design where we don't figure out the details, the client accepts it, and then we work with the contractor and kind of just work back and forth drawing details. So I sort of skipped this, but this was showing the layout of the floors. So on the ground floor, you basically enter into a big space with the two auditoria on the sides and the graduate. Sorry, enter this way with the graduate wing there. Then auditoria, graduate wing, cafeteria. This deck lets you out onto the hill, and then classrooms and offices are up above. So the idea of the project was this kind of green line, which was an open space that cut through the whole building and joined from the campus walk to the hill and the gym beyond. And then this other line, which was the public walk inside the university. So then these are just some shots it's mostly about like the material palette and the way that we were working with different shades. Every floor has like different shades of blue. We were kind of choreographing these blues. In the end, it's kind of subtle, but like working with the graphics, we established a landscape strategy, which was this kind of pattern that went through the building. So that pattern goes through the building on the ground floor, but then goes up into the public spaces. And then there are these kind of big solids, like solid colors that are like either carpet or sometimes tile that mark out the places where people meet. Oops. And that's just showing one more of those spaces where here you can see the pattern is actually carpet, and the pattern, the same pattern is outside as is inside. It's also on the ceiling. So it was kind of like looking at this pattern, which would be continuous, which would go throughout and change materials. Next category, dwelling. This is in Harlem, and it's actually on the top 2 floors of a kind of sandstone, not a brownstone building. And when the client got this project, it was basically this partition space into lots of little rooms, and we opened it up because it was just for one person. So we opened up this space, kind of opened up this part, put in a skylight, and just basically cleared up and opened up the whole space to let light in, to kind of make it brighter. That was one of the things that the client wanted, to have it be brighter, and just simple, just kind of like clean and simple. So this is showing the dining room. And then upstairs, the stair which we designed takes you up this kind of double height space into a kind of, it's not really a bedroom, but the master suite, because it's not closed off except for with furniture. So the way that the room is closed off is with these sliding doors that pocket into the furniture, and this is actually the shower that you're looking through. This is the view from outside, so we did the deck and the bedroom, and it's just meant to be a continuous space except for when the doors are closed. So this is the same university client, but it's under dwelling because this is a dormitory. So it's the same university client, but a different campus. They have 4 campuses in Japan. A little about the structure of education. The kind of top universities are public universities, which are very hard to get into with limited spots. And so then people who don't get into those universities go to private universities. And this is a private university, and they have 4 campuses on the outskirts of Tokyo proper. So it's the equivalent of having campuses in Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx. And so this one is a campus that's near one of the airports, Narita Airport, and it's their youngest campus. It's an international university, and the students who come here are actually students from the United States and all around. They come like in the summer for intensive summer courses, and they like study Japanese and kind of take departmental units. So for this, where you see the red circle, that's the site. I'm not going to show all of the kind of extent of studies for this project, but we actually were approached to work on this project in 2004. And we did a proposal in 2004, and the client wanted a village. So we did a kind of mat housing program, just looking at this idea of the village. But then when it was priced out, it was extremely expensive because there were so many units and lots of like area and square footage that they couldn't afford it, because it's a university, so they actually have a pretty tight budget. So it was shelved for a while. Then in 2010, they asked us to look at it again. We looked at it again. Then in 2014, they asked us to look at it again, and they said it had to be as efficient as possible. So even though when they originally approached us, they said, we don't want a bar building, in the end, we designed a bar building because that was the most efficient and the most, like, the cheapest. So 2014, we did the design, and this happened very quickly too. Our experience with this client has been that if she, and it's a she, the head of the university, has liked what we've done, the project moves very quickly. So we kind of developed a concept using the bar building, which has a south exposure. You're looking at the south exposure, that's why there is the screen. This is like screening to block the sun. That's really common in Japan. The face on the other side is north facing and faces rice fields. This is kind of like the edge of the campus, and it's facing all the rest of the campus, so it's kind of the prime face. But basically the building is shaped like this, is dormitories. And then right here is an international center with a gallery at the bottom. And, actually right here are classrooms and service spaces, and then dormitories up above. It's actually segregated between the sexes, like men and women aren't on the same floors. And there's a suite for like a kind of the equivalent of a headmaster, like someone who would kind of chaperone and be responsible for the students who lives here. So this is the main entry. It's also another kind of entry similar to the business school where you can basically go through the building and like not have to, you can like experience the building without actually entering it. So there are like different ways that happens. Like one is as you're walking through that hole into this, which is the gallery space and a deck, or as you're walking on the bridge up above into this kind of deck area. Behind the screen is actually access or entry into a kind of library kitchen area for the students. So the facade is kind of the big thing on this project. It's a very economical project with very tight units. Its width is actually less than, it's like just a little, it's less than 3 meters. So it's a very narrow bar for its length, and the units are very small. So the other distinguishing feature is that it has 2 corridors. This is actually open to the air, so that like this whole part breathes, and then this corridor beyond is access to the rooms, direct access to the rooms, and it's open intermittently. So it has sliding doors and sliding doors pocket, and when the doors are open, then this is also open. So like that's really only for when it's, you know, the weather is right, whereas this space is always open. But the idea that we were working with here was we wanted to make a kind of engawa space, which in traditional Japanese buildings is the kind of porch space that usually has like sliding doors and access beyond it. And from here, it like expands the space out. And so that's kind of the idea that we were working with these balconies. And we have them so the balconies line up with the sliding doors, which line up with the doors for some of the public spaces inside the dormitory, so that you can get this long length of space. So then these are just details, like just little shots from different parts of the building, of like the reception at the top left, kind of dining hall, library area, gallery area, and then just kind of material shots of stairs and screens. So we also designed the beds, and it's essentially a bunk bed where this is a room for 2 students, so the beds are above and the desk is below, so that each student has their own kind of private desk area, but we also have convenience units where there are 4 students in a room, so there are rooms with 2 students in a room with this configuration, then doubled for 4 students in a room, and then there are rooms where it's just for 1 student, where it's a little bit more like deluxe, and then also where it's more of a suite. And the reason that the rooms are like that is because the students are coming from different countries with different economic constraints, and the university wanted to make sure that they could all afford to live in the dormitory. For the screen, we worked with a aluminum manufacturer. So what's kind of unique about the screen is that the slats are at different depths. They're like 3 millimeters deep, 5 millimeters, and 7 millimeters deep. And that's part of the effect, is that they're not flush. They're these different depths. And then they're also kind of staggered. A lot of the, I guess like the first project, the business school, it's kind of made with simple shapes and simple blocks of color, but as our projects have, this is one of our more recent projects, so it still has like kind of a simple form, but there's also this kind of growing kind of pattern articulation in the later projects. So now the arts, back at this is actually the Saitama campus, the first one that I showed at the entry here. And we were asked to do a museum, a small museum for the collection of the founder of the university. So this is the side facade of the university. It's the Mizuta Museum of Art of the University Museum. And then it actually has, because of the way that we designed it, it has a shape that goes like this, basically like a sleeve. And so it has two kind of entry facades, one which faces the public as you enter the university, and one which is more facing the campus. But when you come from the entry facing the university, you have to make a decision about like how to enter. So you can go this way, or you could go this way. These are signposts which actually have etchings of ukiyo-e prints in them, and the museum is a ukiyo-e museum. So if you were here, you would kind of read these and you would know that that's the way to go for the museum. If you go this way, you basically end up outside. But I'll show more. So this is what you would see as you're going to the left, and then going to the right, you would enter into the museum, either here or further back. So the development for this project came from not wanting to have an elevator. And so we were trying to work out a way to have the ramps access the second floor, because if there wasn't going to be an elevator, they had to be able to get things up to the second floor. In the end, once the building was past its concept phase, curators got involved, and of course there had to be an elevator because art is heavy and they're not going to take everything up a ramp. It's too, the insurance wouldn't even cover it if they were to do that. So sometimes things happen for a funny logic, and then they just kind of stick, but that was one of the funny things. So we basically were working with these 3 galleries, 3 boxes that we were ramping up to, and that we wanted to float within another, and they had to be sealed boxes to protect the collections, and we were kind of floating them within another envelope, which could be aerated. And so this is showing here like just the shell that's on the outside, the way that it's like a flat surface, there's an excavation, then it folds around these volumes. That surface is articulated with a series of slats. The slats themselves were coming from an inspiration of this really famous ukiyo-e print, which has rain, and the kind of motif for rain was actually like enlarged, and that's what we were using to make these patterns. But we kind of tweaked it a little because we wanted it also to be random, but we were trying to get something that in a way had a graphic sensibility that was similar to the prints themselves. This is one of the galleries. This is actually the traditional gallery, the most conditioned space, and the kind of black wood with the white cases where the art would go. That's the kind of traditional treatment. Then this is the entry, actually. And so in the entry, which is in the middle of the building with the traditional gallery this way and then a contemporary gallery that way, we designed a reception desk, and then the treatment in the space is different from the treatment outside. So the treatment outside is very smooth. The treatment inside is this kind of, it's actually a very traditional Japanese treatment as well, using boards that are expressed, but we did something slightly different, which you can see here, where we had the boards not flush with each other. We wanted this kind of extra lip so that there would be a little bit more of a like a texture to it. And so this is just showing like the kind of layout for the panels to get this pattern, and then it would basically be repeated as these kind of cast-in-place panels were made. The panels on the outside were actually not cast in place, they were precast, and they were done in a factory with a slightly different, a different kind of technique. So what you see here, I keep pushing the wrong buttons, is you can see here like the way that there are these two walks and then the galleries, and you enter in the middle. This is the upper floor, this is the lower floor, and when you come here you end up, in that space. You end up back here. And so this is kind of showing where you would be if you came down and around. You basically would come outside, or you could go into a glass box gallery, which is a gallery for artisans. So where there's art up above, it's more like artisans and craft below, but it's still part of the kind of art concept. And then what you're seeing here, the landscaping, like that's also something that we designed as part of the project, so that like it's like sculpted up the hill. So Mokata, another museum project, is in Brooklyn. This was their kind of former home, which is a small home on the corner in Fort Greene on Hanson Place. And so this client came to us and had one request. Well, two requests. One was she wanted flexible gallery space. Everyone always wants flexible gallery space. But she also wanted a map of Africa in the reception area. And so what you're seeing here is the identity of the museum that we kind of developed as light boxes projecting out where the gallery is. So the windows are blocked off, but we made light boxes with their identity in them. And then this corner is looking at the reception area, which is where you enter. So the approach with, and this is kind of showing the parts, so it's showing the approach toward flexible gallery space was to have wall panels, these kind of movable walls that were on rotating, kind of like pivot hinges here that would be custom made. So these walls could rotate flat against this perimeter wall so that the space could be one big space or different size spaces. And then in the reception area, what you're seeing is a map of a flattened out map of the time zones of the world on the space. And then within it, we were locating the African diaspora. So the way that we interpreted the map was to like make a map that located not just Africa, but actually not Africa, but the African diaspora, because it was the Museum of the African Diaspora. And the idea was to not have it be a 2D thing, but to have it be both 2D and 3D. So for us, that was the big exploration. Like the first was, well, what is the map? How do we deal with it? And these are migration routes and migration cities for people of the African diaspora. So we just located them using military maps, economic migration maps, slave trade maps, and just kind of located them all in the space. On the time zones, we worked with a woodworker to, once we figured out the system, he fabricated the system for us. And it's actually using a very traditional kind of Japanese handicraft where everything is doweled into everything else, and he didn't use any nails to make it. Part of the inspiration for this was baskets, because we were working for another client on an exhibit for baskets and basket weaving. So what you see here is a kind of 2D painting of the map, and then a 3D projection of the map as the furniture in the reception area with all of the different cities located on it. So with this, we also made a kind of booklet that showed, just a booklet for the map that showed the African diaspora that's within it. Then this is the gallery, and here you can see some of the structure. Like they're basically just these big poles with like sleeves and rollers to let it move. And then a view looking out, where here you can see more of the 2D in the 3D. Okay, so the last section that I'll show will be unBuilding, and no, actually there's one more section, and research. So unBuilding race is one of the categories, and there are a few projects in this. This one is a shotgun house in Project Row Houses in Texas, which is an artist's, I guess you could call it an artist's colony. But the artist colony is situated in a series of row houses, along with row houses that people are living in. So the constraints for the people who live there is it's for single mothers. They have to be enrolled in school, and they can basically live there for free. And then artists come in residency periods, like for several months, like from 3 to 6 months or 12 months, to do projects. And the person who kind of thought of all of this was an artist himself, and he was very much interested in shotgun houses and in this community, and he wanted to have like an exchange, like a way for people in the community could like benefit from the art itself. So this house was actually already gutted when I started working on it, and there were curious histories about the house. One is, the first one for me was just the myth of the name shotgun, and the way that shotgun is related to the fact that it has two doors, one lined up with another, and that shotgun, it's like the idea that you could shoot a gun and that the bullet would just go straight from one door out the next. And how that itself is layered on top of housing for black people, basically, for people of a certain kind of economic and racial class, and what does that mean? And then also this house in particular had traces of where walls had been that were not there anymore. And this one was really curious because this one closed off, and there was actually another door here so that you could have a separate rental unit that was teeny. And a lot of these houses had that. So even though these were units where people would live multiple families, they could have still a space where someone would a stranger or someone would be renting right there. What was really unique about this too was in the back at the other door was this beautiful garden. And so the houses with the mothers were on the other side, basically on the other side of the block from this. And so part of the project came from the being in the garden and the shadows of light in the trees. And this project is all about ideas about the house of light and the house of dark. But then the way that the light and dark play has to do with shadows. And so that's what that image, which won't stay, is supposed to show. So in doing research about shotgun houses, which is what I started with on this project, so researching just the name of the house and then the type, where does the shotgun type come from? In doing research, it's a kind of contested history. Some histories say it comes from West Africa. Other histories say it's a plantation type. The shotgun type is very similar to a railroad apartment type. And so as I was researching the shotgun, I started to also research plantation architecture. And looking at plantation architecture, I was reading about just I read this one very interesting reading by a scholar named John Block, which was talking about plantation networks. And so, and that very much influenced this project. So it's the idea that the plantation didn't exist in isolation. It exists with the fields around it, but then there were other plantations with fields around them. And in the fields, that's where the slaves would go when they could get a chance, sometimes at great risk, to see other slaves. It's a place where they would go to exchange news, to have community, or just not to be seen or to run away. And so there are songs that talk about the Paddy Rollers, and the Paddy Rollers are basically the patrollers, the people who would patrol the edges of the plantation and try to keep everyone in line. And so I became really, really curious about this and started to try to find more information, and was looking at also just what does it mean, this house, what could a house like this mean? What does domesticity mean for people who are in this position? And I started looking at slave narratives, looking for traces of domesticity. And basically what's put in the house in the words are the things that I found. And I grouped them in 4 categories. One is hearth, one is field, and one has to do with autonomy. And so basically the narratives that I found for the field were all about people going into the fields to meet each other. So it was slave narratives where to go into the fields might mean you would, risk being whipped or something, but you were going because you wanted to learn how to read, or you wanted to have church, or you wanted to meet someone in your family who was from another plantation, but you could meet if you were in that kind of exterior space. The hearth was about family and love and kindness, and those narratives were about people who did things like sold themselves back into slavery so that they could be together with someone they loved. Autonomy were stories that were like, there was one story of a little girl who was freed, and a lot of the stories talked about once people were freed, they just kind of stayed where they were. And so she had stayed where she was, and one day some soldiers came by on a horse and said, "You're free, you have to go." So they kind of took her on a horse to, take her away, but she didn't get to take the things that she prized the most. And so to me, that was like, it represented someone having a sense of themselves and a sense of autonomy. And so those narratives were actually placed on the windows in the house. And they were all, because the house, as I got it, was already white, so it was set up for like a perfect gallery setting. Everything that I put into it was white as well. This project, De facto du jour, was an installation, but I should say, like, these installations that I'm showing were done by invitation, and the kind of larger framework for the installation was someone else's project. So like the shotgun framework was someone else's project. And with this, I was invited to take one city out of 13 along this historic train line. So the train line is actually a north-south route that was critical for the Great Migration in the 20th century of African Americans from the south to the north during the Jim Crow era. And the city that I took is Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, seat of the Liberty Bell, and just kind of critical to the ideas of democracy and freedom. And from that city, I mapped all the others. So de facto de jure is basically by fact or by implication. So something that's not like a law or a rule, but it's implicit, not explicit. And so what I was looking at were rules along the train line and rules that govern space. So I was interested in kind of mapping a spatial topography along the train line. And what I looked at, it had to all be somehow contained within a travel box. That was one of the constraints. But most of the project was really trying to figure out how to map rules of public accommodation within the 20th century. And in the end, it took the form of a game. So you would get the box, and inside the box would be 3 dials, really simple. You would pick a time, you would pick a city that the train would stop in, and then you would pick a public accommodation that you'd like to go to. So the year is the train stops in, the traveler goes to X. Public accommodations are, of course, like the train station is a public accommodation, but hospital, school, amusement park, church, things like that. And it also included home. So once you pick those places, you would pick a card. So you would, go to the city, the time, pick a card, and then you would look at it and see what the rules for the public accommodation were. So those kind of these codes are for the public accommodations, the city, the time, and then whatever the law was. So, so basically, like if one wanted to go to a church, but you were of a certain race at a certain time, you couldn't go to the church. And these are just all the laws that were passed that govern space. And the idea of having it be a game was that I wanted to share this information, and also like working on this in my office, we all agreed that this should be something that people could engage in a way that it was interactive so that you could feel it, and it's not like someone telling it to you. So it would have to be something that you could just kind of play with, and games are really interesting because you can educate people without them knowing they're being educated, and it can be kind of fun, and it doesn't have to be didactic. So, so that was how it took this form, actually. But the interesting thing about this, so before the cards, there were actually all of these maps, just mapping the laws within this kind of larger matrix, trying to understand this idea of like spatial and legal topographies, like the spatial effects of legal topographies. And so the way things were mapped was, this is 0. So 0 is here, and it's negative and positive. And negative is segregation, positive is integration. And actually this is kind of like the Mason-Dixon line, like right along here, like Maryland, DC. DC was interesting because it actually, in terms of its laws, it reflected the South a lot, like more than the North, even though we kind of think of it as being located more north. Then these are all public accommodations, and everything is sort of like a mirror, so it reflects in both directions. Time is along this axis too, so the time goes from emancipation, first Civil Rights Act in 1864 or 5 to the second Civil Rights Act in 1964 or 5. And then it sort of goes past that a little in terms of its time. And so these are here like major kind of events and acts that were passed, like laws that were for either segregation or integration. So all of these things were mapped, and the dots show density. So the bigger the dot, the more laws were passed. The smaller, the fewer laws that were passed in those places. And then this is just a totally different way of mapping the same thing, a linear map, showing longer lines, more laws passed, shorter lines, less. But the most curious thing was the way that laws were passed, and then in the wording, you could tell that people were breaking the law. So, like one law might say that you're not permitted to go to swimming pools. But then another law would be passed that would say you're not allowed to go to swimming pools and beaches. And then another law would be passed that would say swimming pools and beaches and, I don't know, like whatever is like the next biggest thing. So each law, you could tell that people were circumventing the law by the way that they tried to top it with another law. And then the other way you could tell that the laws were being broken, you could also tell who was breaking the laws by the penalties. So in some cases, the penalties were against train conductors. You knew train conductors were breaking the law. If it was against ministers, you knew ministers were marrying people who shouldn't be married to each other. And then they also targeted specific people. So like white women were charged along with ministers for marrying across their race. So that was also one of the kind of surprising things and interesting things. Also laws against the Chinese. when railroads were being built, the Chinese were brought in, and then there were all of these laws about racial insecurities that were passed against the Chinese. But like they occurred in different states and at different times, and they really just reflected the insecurities. So the outside was a different kind of map, which was mapping, which you can see here, like every state, and just as a kind of like segregation or integration index. And they were just like mapped on the outside of the box, integration to your left, segregation to your right. The last category for this is gender. And this is a project that I did, and this project predates everything that I've shown so far, which they weren't in order, but this is the one that's the first one, which I read this manifesto about women standing urinating, and this manifesto was published in what's called a fanzine, which I guess would be, I don't know what the equivalent would be like right now. It might be like if you made like if you did something on Snapchat or something like that, and published it online. But this was part of like a movement called the Riot Girl movement, which was a kind of not feminist with like the big F feminist movement, but actually more of a punk feminist movement. And so I read this, and as a designer, I just started wondering about it, but then also just with my own kind of research interests, started wondering about it. And I kind of did a drawing of a project, and then after I did the drawing of the project, I did research on this area and then actually built an object. But it began in a way as a meditation on identity. So it's about an object, but it's also about female identity, and as it's kind of put on women as a problem. So a lot of the literature that I read in working on this project talked about the problem of female anatomy, or the problem of like, I don't know, like female whatever. So I think the very first thing I did, though, was I made a standard, like a specification, kind of riffing off of American Standard, where I put a drawing of the object. This is actually like another drawing of the object after I made it, and kind of projected a version of myself, like just a head of a brown woman with this toilet. And so it's a project called Our Standard, and then the project itself is Femme Pissoir. So it's all about new standards and new objects for women. And part of it has to do with objects that are utilitarian, but also objects of desire. So this is showing the first drawing of the object, and just trying to think about like more utilitarian things about how would this actually be done, how would it work, and then just a shot from like when I actually did start to build it. I blew the drawings up full scale and then started reworking it actually in my studio. This is just some of the but like side effects of the research, were drawings that I did from the research that I was looking at, and then all of the different accoutrements that came with this object in order to make it viable. So it's not just a urinal for women. In order for it to really work, clothing had to be addressed. Things like toilet training actually came up, and and are kind of primary as something that needs to be addressed. But also in using it, there's the idea that you're actually addressing the female identity. These are shots from Alexander Kierer's The Bathroom, which was at the time the only book I could find that even talked about bathrooms, but it was this extensive, huge study of bathrooms and toilet practices. So the way that it's been installed is parasitically, where it would be in a location either hooked up to water bottles or hooked up to existing fixtures, and it would work that way. So here, the water would come in and the wastewater would go out. There's a blow dryer, so you don't need paper. There's the mirror, kind of riffing off the idea that women's lines at women's toilets are so long because they're always at the mirror, so you've got the mirror there. But then it also has pants that are redesigned so that the zipper allows a woman to keep her pants on and not be exposed when she uses the urinal. And there's also a ring so that you don't have things hanging down and you can operate the zipper. The ring is actually an idea I got from a friend who was doing research in the 19th century, who told me about how women used to have these rings to lift up the hoops on their hoop dresses when they had to do whatever in the bygone era. But anyway, so these are just clips of details from this. And the drawing became a kind of instruction diagram that was also part of the object so that someone would know how to stand and use it. And traveling in Japan, it's actually interesting because the toilets there were pit toilets. The first time I went in 1999, there were actually quite a lot of pit toilets, toilets in the floor. And now they have Western toilets more, but they also have diagrams that show people how to use the toilet. So it is a necessary thing when you introduce an object to have instructions for how to use it. I think I might just kind of go a little faster. So this one is really it's a project I'm working on now, but this was done in 2010 as a kind of installation project. It was outdoors in a sculpture biennial, and it was really a play on doilies and wallpaper and tea. So it was taking these kind of feminine things and then building them in steel and inserting them outside in a playful way. The last thing I wanted to talk about was just how all of this relates to teaching. So I'm going to just show one project, and it's actually a project that I've done many times. I'm doing it right now. I don't call it this anymore. It's kind of become less encumbered, I suppose, but it's a studio that's based on a series of challenges. When I first ran it, it was the idea that there would be a new challenge every week. So the first studio was really this runaway. It was really runaway because it was like you were just, before you finished one thing, you had to move on to the next. So it wasn't about deep dives each time. It was about responding to a prompt. And it was actually devised in some ways in response to practice, to the way that in practice you get asked to do all kinds of things. And as a young practice especially, you try to do them. And you might not actually have the wherewithal to do it, but you try to do it. And you're doing competitions, you're just doing all these different things. And so the idea of this studio was that it was a jump start to practice, and that through doing these projects, really what the student has to rely on is themselves and their own interests. So it's not about my interests, it's about their interests. And that interest is the thing that develops through these projects. It's the one thing that they can rely on. So the way that this has developed over time is that I've learned that I can do this kind of project within one site, and all of the projects actually become a story about that site or a story about an idea. So the first time I did the site was Long Island City, but every challenge was in a different part of Long Island City, and it actually, when all the students' projects came together, it was a map of the development and the changes that were happening in that area. I'm doing it right now, actually in MIT and Yale, and we're using a framework, Thresholds, which is what I'm kind of researching. But Thresholds is not just the kind of threshold that's architectural, but it's also social thresholds, like these kind of limits, like a threshold in science is a limit before something changes, or a limit before crisis, actually. And so we're using threshold as a way of looking at other cultures, but also as a way of looking at form. But the first time I did it, it was more like just a lot of different challenges. So that's what I'm showing here. So actually these pages are the result of the final challenge for this studio, which was to design the book. So they all had, for their final challenge, to design a book that would contain everyone else's challenge in it. And one student was unlucky enough to win, and then she basically, her design was the design that everyone else's work had to fit into, but as things go, if you're the designer, you end up doing a lot of the work yourself. So I didn't do this again after we did it this time. The next time, the students each had to do their own books so that one student didn't have the burden. But anyway, the way she laid it out was really quite nice, and this is showing each challenge. Everything was kind of on a schedule, so it's also about the clock ticking, and the idea was to just show the pressure, I think, and the schedule and the difference of the challenges, and then for each student, how they responded to it. So the idea here is taking clips of their responses with the challenges, and then each student had their own pages. So what was nice about her layout was the way that she made a kind of key on the side. So every student had that key, and then the highlight is sort of showing them the challenge and their interest. And then each student had, specific things that they were interested in. Some were more architectural, some were more product oriented. The challenges ranged from being like a kind of, I tried to always have a competition, so this one has a competition for a post-human dwelling. There's a planless skyscraper, which, not a competition, but just one that I gave them because I thought, well, could they do something tall? And they could. Then one was for a crisis shelter, and she did a trash can shelter, this student. One was with public housing, Amsterdam houses behind Lincoln Center, and the idea of, could you make a kind of insertion that could be an income generator for the public housing projects, and so that was one. So this is really just showing one student's approach to these different challenges and the kind of language that was developed, but then all within the framework that was given by another student's challenge. Yeah, so for me, this studio kind of represents, I think it represents a lot of my interest in teaching, at least what I've what I've kind of come to after, when you first start teaching, you're basically teaching what you've been taught. And I've been teaching long enough that I'm not teaching what I've been taught, I'm teaching something else. And so what I'm teaching is not necessarily about context or site specific. It's not something that's like growing up from the site or the context, but it is related to context. And it's not always driven by program, and it's not driven by process either, because there's not enough time to develop a process in it. Even though all of those things are part of it, it's a different way of approaching a studio project. For where the students are right now, so I taught this last spring, and then I'm teaching it now this spring. And the final challenge is a thesis, is that they would not have disconnected challenges, but that they actually make sense of the work that they've done the whole semester and put it together as a thesis. And the way that it works is that each challenge is, I format each one so that they are basically creating documents all throughout the semester and building up an argument that they would then present at the end. But they also have to revise that argument as they come to realize what it is towards the end of the semester. So I think this is pretty much it. So I just wanted to show you a kind of range of what practice could be, or what my practice is, as it's developed over time. Thank you.